Only in America.
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 Welcome to Only in America. I'm Ali Noorani. This week, the Harvard academic who chaired a comprehensive study of immigrant integration.
So people always say, well, my grandparents,
Your grandparents,
my
right?
Irish and Italian grandparents immigrated and they assimilated, but now people are not. And in fact, what we find is, for instance, Mexicans are learning English faster than Italians did, and intermarrying faster than Italians did. We find faster progress now than earlier.
And, as we have found, employers are taking the lead in helping their immigrant workforce learn English and become Americans.
So we've now built a program of over 350 businesses called New American Workforce that is offering citizenship services and English classes at the work site, and is really looking at how we holistically help the individual at the work site get the skills that they need to reach their fullest potential, but then also to carry over into the community and into the nation to really improve immigrant integration.
From the National Immigration Forum, I'm Ali Noorani with Only in America. For years, opponents of immigration have claimed immigrants are not becoming American, rather that they are living in enclaves. Or even worse, opponents of immigration claim the diversification of America is a threat. Tucker Carlson of Fox News asked and answered this question in his own over-the-top way.
How precisely is diversity our strength? Since you've made this our new national motto, please be specific as you explain it. Can you think, for example, of other institutions, such as, marriage or military units, in which the less people have in common, the more cohesive they are? Do you get along better with your neighbors or your coworkers if you can't understand each other or share no common values? Please be honest as you answer this question. And if diversity is our strength, why is it okay for the rest of us to surrender one of our central rights, freedom of speech, to just a handful of tech monopolies?
Well, in spite of Tucker's rantings and ravings, America is becoming more diverse. And those of us at the National Immigration Forum, we're focused on solutions. Solutions that, yes, help America thrive because new Americans have the skills and opportunities that they need to reach their fullest potential. Along these lines, a few years ago, we partnered with the Walmart Foundation and the JPB Foundation to develop a cutting-edge English language learning program, Skills and Opportunity for the New American Workforce. Over the first 2 years of the program, we worked with Kroger in Houston, Whole Foods in New York, and Publix in Miami to help 1,000 workers improve their English language skills. This is Juan Gomez, an immigrant from the Dominican Republic who works at Whole Foods. He shared with us why the program, Skills and Opportunity for the New American Workforce, and learning English was so important to him.
For the way you talk to the customer is very important, especially, you have to connect to the customer, you have to engage, you have to make eye contact. It's very important. And one thing is important too, when your coworker see you like a leader, they want to copy everything you did, For me, it's very important too. That's why I want to be almost perfect,
To help us understand the challenge we are trying to meet and the program's success, I talked with my colleague, Jennie Murray, the forum's Director of Integration Programs. Jennie, thank you so much for joining Only in America today. From the perspective of the employers that you work with, what is the economic imperative that they face that leads them to want to improve the English language skills of their workforce?
The employers that we work with are mainly employing foreign-born workers who are the front line of their operations. For retail industry, that would mean those who are in cashier roles, serving in produce and deli and other customer-facing types of roles, and hospitality, same thing. So many of the employers that we're working with are thinking about how do they both retain their employee by getting them the skills they need and to be able to continue their career advancement, but also how do they continue to improve store or business, productivity, operational goals that meet the bottom line.
So, over the last few years, the Forum has built this contextualized English language learning program, also known as Skills and Opportunity for the New American Workforce. Take a minute and describe how the program works.
The program is a blended learning opportunity. So it's offered to incumbent workers. It's 40% in person, 60% online with an online app that we developed. And it's been created to be very successful for both employee schedules, but also employer operations. It runs around 12 weeks long, and it gives employees the opportunity to really get the English language training they need to improve their career pathway potential right at the work site and sort of geared towards their industry area. So it's contextualized, which is what makes it really different and exciting and effective.
So now let's look across our economy. With increased English language skills, what does that mean not just for the employer, but for the employee and their ability to reach their fullest potential?
We're thinking about this holistically. We're thinking about integration, immigrant integration on behalf of the individual. So yes, that's for the work site. So we're hoping to give them the English skills they need to kind of move up along their career pathway to begin to be promoted. In fact, in year 2 of the program, we saw a 37% promotion rate for the 1,000 participants in the retail industry who partnered. And so, one, it unlocks career potential and allows them to continue to move up in their career. But then we're also thinking about it, more holistically, in that we're helping that individual be able to enroll their child in school better, speak more clearly, communicate more clearly with their children's teachers, or know how to file their tax return, and all of the things to vote, and all the things that make them successful participants in the community and in their own lives, and really help their ability to integrate as a person. And then we know they will also then thrive at the work site in their career and stabilize their families.
That was Jennie Murray, the Forum's Director of Integration Programs. Now let's turn to this week's conversation. So last fall, I found myself at Harvard University on a brisk morning. In addition to drinking a lot of Dunkin' Donuts coffee, not the hazelnut stuff, mind you, because, well, hazelnuts should just stay on the tree, I was actually there to speak with my good friend Mary Waters, the John L. Loeb Professor of Sociology at Harvard. Growing up in a vibrant Brooklyn neighborhood whose energy came from the children and grandchildren of immigrants, Mary was inspired to study ethnic identity, racial identity, and immigration in graduate school. An interest she has carried to her academic career on the shores of the Charles River. In 2010, Mary was elected to the National Academy of Sciences, and she later chaired the Academy's panel on the integration of immigrants into American society. The subsequent report, vast and substantive in scope, broke down the myths surrounding the integration of today's immigrants. The report's bottom line was that, by every measure, immigrants and native-born were resembling each other more and more. In fact, faster than in previous waves of immigration to the U.S. Our conversation that morning went from storytelling to data and research and back to storytelling. How did you find yourself here on the 5th floor of William James Hall at Harvard University?
So I grew up in Flatbush section of Brooklyn, and all 4 of my grandparents were immigrants from Ireland. And my neighborhood growing up was quite diverse, and a lot of children and grandchildren of immigrants. And so when I got to graduate school, that's what I decided to study, was ethnic identity, racial identity, and immigration. And so it's been a growth field for the last 30 years or so. And so I've kind of been in the middle of it, studying it as it has unfolded.
It is quite the growth industry, right?
Yeah.
Like the dot-com folks, they got nothing on us.
That's right.
But what was it like growing up in Flatbush at that time?
Well, the story I like to tell is that I went away to college. I went to Catholic school. I went away to college, and my first few days at college at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, I called my mother and I said, there's white people going into a Protestant church. And I had never seen that before. I didn't know there were white Protestants. In my world, there were Jews, there were Catholics, and then there were black people. And the black people were the Protestants. And I had never met a white Protestant until I went away to college. So it was just a very ethnic area and very diverse, but also, everybody had their little pockets of friends and family. And so there was a little bit of tensions. The Catholic kids would beat up the Jewish kids and vice versa. but it was a great place to grow up.
So as you started to study the issues, was there kind of like a first surprise? You know, when as you were kind of digging into it, you said, "Whoa, I didn't expect this."
Well, I started studying black immigrants in the 1980s and early 1990s. And that was because I got the idea to study black immigrants to New York because my brother was a school teacher, and he said, you know, I have these kids in my class and they are all African Americans, but the parents are all very divided, and there's American people and then there's people from Jamaica and Barbados, and they're all very different, and the kids all are kind of the same. I thought, oh, that's a really interesting sociological question.
Mm-hmm.
So I started working on that. And that was surprising at first because I think we didn't recognize ethnicity within the black community. And so I ended up writing a book on that topic.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I grew up in California where, and then I remember when I first moved to Boston in 98, 99, and same thing. I just didn't realize that. In fact, what always sticks in my mind is the first time I went to a sub shop in, I think, Jamaica Plain or Mission Hill, and a guy looked like me, but he spoke with a Jamaican accent. I still haven't recovered.
Yeah, when you meet Chinese people from Jamaica, it's like, wow.
But many people just don't realize that about Boston and New England, you know? So when you look at the data and the way that the community is changing, the way the country is changing, what do you make of the last decade of America's immigration debate?
I think there are a couple of different strands happening that may not necessarily go together, but I think overwhelmingly immigrants are doing well in terms of becoming Americans. That's really the master trend over the last many decades. I think that the growth of the undocumented that really stopped about 10 years ago, the growth of them stopped, but the presence of undocumented people throughout the country has shaped the immigration debate in ways that is not helpful, and it's not reflective, really, of a lot of the progress that we can make as Americans in terms of immigration. And then I think that there's been, especially in the last few years, a real manipulation of people's fears of change and a way in which things that could be handled much better are leading to a lot of tensions and fears about immigration.
So it was a few years ago you chaired a panel at the National Academy of Science where you released this massive report looking at the data. What are some of the highlights from that?
Yeah, that was a study, and we put together 19 social scientists from across all the social sciences, and we looked at lots of different aspects of integration. The question was, are immigrants integrating into the U.S.? And what we found was whatever we measured, whether it was socioeconomic progress, whether it was language, whether it was attitudes, intermarriage, residential segregation, everything we looked at, immigrants were becoming more alike with natives. Natives and immigrants were coming to resemble each other. So in a lot of ways, we saw just great progress and faster progress for immigrants now than 100 years ago. So people always say, well, you know, my grandparents,
your grandparents,
my Irish and Italian grandparents immigrated and they assimilated, but now people are not. And in fact, what we find is, for instance, Mexicans are learning English faster than Italians did, and intermarrying faster than Italians did. If you measure in the time since immigration to when we measure 10 years out, 20 years out, 30 years out, we find faster progress now than earlier.
Why do you think that is?
I think in part it's that our society is sped up in a lot of ways, right? So that with television and media, kids and immigrants pick up English faster. So I think that is understandable. I think also there's a lot more acceptance of immigrants now. There are ways in which immigrants have an easier time becoming Americans than with a lot of the pressure to change your name and not speak your language and all those kinds of things that our grandparents and great-grandparents experienced.
Do you think that there's also an element where if immigrants were coming today, they can maintain their connection to their home country through the media, through travel, and is it therefore easier for them to integrate into the U.S. because because they don't feel like they're losing something, whereas 50, 100 years ago, there wasn't that connection?
Yeah, I mean, people tried to have that connection 50, 100 years ago, but it was just so much slower and harder. But yeah, I think both our American society's acceptance of the fact that we're a nation of immigrants and celebration of all of the different cultures here helps, but also that transnational connection gives people a sense that they're not cut off and that they're not giving up who they are, but they also are moving into this new society. Mm-hmm. And I think in all those ways, we have a great story to tell about immigration.
How do we tell that story? Because it feels like we're not being so successful right now.
Right. Well, it's a challenge for anybody in our society right now who deals in facts and reality, that you get different stories depending on where you get your media from, etc. So, for instance, the issue of immigration and crime, we reviewed that in the National Academy report. Immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, commit crime at much, much lower rates than native-born Americans. But you just can't get that message out. I was on a talk radio program, people were calling in, and I talked about statistics, and they were like, well, what about the one guy who shot somebody? Mm-hmm. And so it's very hard to break through that, and I think that we have to keep telling the story both with statistics but also with narrative about real people. I think that can lead to some progress.
Before we hit record, you were talking about a new project you're working on and looking at the intersection between mass incarceration and immigration detention. As you're working on that project, what are you seeing?
Since 2008, a couple of things changed in terms of mass incarceration, which the United States incarcerates more people than any other country in the world. We have just skyrocketing numbers of people in prison. But beginning with the recession in 2008, there was a move to find alternatives to prison and to get people out of prison, partly because it was just costing so much money to have so many of our young people in prison. And so prison population started to go down. At the same time, after 1996, we became much more punitive towards undocumented immigrants and began detaining more and more of them. And so these two graphs were kind of crossing one another. And I think it turns out that we are filling up some of these empty beds in prisons around the country and in for-profit detention centers. We're emptying out native-born Americans and putting immigrant detainees in there. And I think that this is a financial success for states because they're letting people out of prison because they have to pay for that. But the federal government reimburses them for anybody who is an undocumented person who they keep in their jail or prison. Mm-hmm. So I think that this is a way to keep some of these prisons filled with undocumented people who are awaiting a hearing before an immigration judge or deportation.
And it's on the Fed's dime instead of the state's dime.
Yeah.
What do we in the immigration space learn from the mass incarceration effort?
Yeah, well, I think organizations like yours that try to bring people together to think about immigration in a more realistic and concrete way are good. And I think what we learned from the criminal justice reform is that it's not a right and left issue, right? It's something that people can come together on who may be Democratic or Republican, but they see the waste of having so many people in prison and the costs, etc. And I think we're in a similar spot with immigration in that the majority of Americans want a path to citizenship. Americans agree more about immigration than we do about a lot of issues that divide us. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of support. In fact, right now we're in the middle of the highest support for immigration we've had since 2000. So our politics are not reflecting public opinion about trying to solve the problem of undocumented people, which most people do not want to see these long-standing people who have been in their communities for a long time deported. And we need to find a way with our politics to get those cross-party agreements and just get past this logjam.
So is it a matter of doing a better job of telling the story of why we're still paying for this? Mm-hmm. It may not be our local or state taxes, but it's our federal taxes.
Right.
But then that kind of runs into this lack of trust and belief in the federal government. I always get a sense that people trust their city councilor 10 times more than they trust some random congressman, even though they love their congressman. Right.
Yeah, I do think that people do have much more mistrust for the federal government. But that's not necessarily a reason to be supporting putting all these people in detention.
Yeah.
And I actually think what's happening around the country in terms of this high level of support for immigration and this high level of support for a path to citizenship for dreamers as well as for undocumented people is that more and more Americans are getting to know immigrants, and the initial fear of a large influx of new people into communities that weren't used to that is slowly giving way to a real on-the-ground connections with immigrants. And I think that that is changing people's minds from being afraid of somebody they don't really understand to saying, oh, that's the guy down the street who helps me with my car. As long as people begin to have contact with immigrants and get to know them as people in their churches and their workplaces and their schools, we're going to have more and more support, I think, for immigration.
So is that the reason to be optimistic?
That's the reason to be optimistic. I think the reason to worry is the fear-mongering and the large number of undocumented people. The reason to be optimistic is the results of our report, which shows very successful assimilation of people, and the growing contact between immigrants and native-born people, leading to a kind of acceptance that doesn't always get reported in the media, but is the day-to-day life of people, I think. You're out around the country. Do you see this happening?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. And, a lot of what I think we need to do is lift up the story of that small town that is thriving because of immigration. And the endorsement of local leadership in that change and doing the hard work at a local level. And, I guess the way I've been putting it is that people come to love the Maria or the Muhammad that they know, but they remain terrified of the Maria or the Muhammad they don't know.
Right.
Right? And how do we create that bridge?
Right.
That, I feel like, is the challenge.
Yeah, I agree. I think that that is a challenge, and we need more knowledge about one another, and we also need more ways in which we can get together and get to know each other.
So where do you think we're going to be on immigration in 10 years?
I think if we can deal with the problems with our political system.
That's a different podcast.
A small if. But I think we'll be in a much better place because I think the longer people are here and the more connections people make, there will be growing acceptance. The worry I have is the problem really of undocumented people being prevented from becoming full citizens. And if that's allowed to continue, that really drives a wedge between immigrants and other Americans and is just not good for the overall assimilation of immigrants, and it's also just not good for a democracy to have so many people who have so few rights.
What about the global context of this and the way that people are seeing migration internationally? Because I think as an advocate, we have failed to help the public understand why people are moving. Therefore, one of the only places they have to go is Fox News.
Right.
So would you agree with my theory that most people see immigration in a global context, whereas we try to explain it in a domestic context, and therefore we're kind of talking past each other?
What do you mean by most people see it in a global context?
So, meaning that a lot of folks sitting at home at night, they see the kid on the train from Central America, the family in the raft from Syria, and their assumption is that that's their next door neighbor in 2 weeks. And that terrifies them. And there's very little opportunity for somebody to understand why somebody's migrating, understanding when they will get to the U.S., if they'll get to the U.S. And I just feel like that's a really big disconnect that makes actually the next 10 years much more difficult because those numbers are just going to increase.
Yes, yeah. We're facing a big challenge with refugees, people fleeing for their lives, and it's going to increase with climate change, I think, and with the unrest around the world. And I think there's a couple of issues embedded in there. One is that most Americans have really no idea how the immigration system works. Even lawmakers don't even understand. I've been reading this weekend about senators saying, well, people should apply for asylum at the American embassy in Mexico. You can't do that. Right? So they don't understand how complicated it is to get into the United States, even as a refugee, how difficult it is. But also, if they were in that same situation, they would be on that train or on that boat. So they're not really understanding the desperation of people, but also the ways in which the international system works to kind of screen people and to resettle people, and the success we've had with that. So yeah, there also should be much more in-depth reporting and understanding about the situations in these countries that are leading people to take these very desperate measures to get here. I mean, people are walking from Honduras, right? With babies in their arms. Think about what it must be like in those countries to make you make that decision that you're safer walking to the United States with your baby. I mean, it's got to be just a terrifying situation. And most Americans, if they could sit down and talk to these people, would be driving down there with their cars. They really would be very helpful to people in need. That's an American value.
Right.
And so there's this disconnect because we don't connect on a human basis. We are just seeing somebody on television and not understanding the context and reacting with fear.
Mm-hmm. Whereas, so kind of going back to what you're saying earlier, in that small town in America, they have that relationship.
Yeah.
There's no relationship or understanding of why that mother got her baby in her arms is walking to the U.S.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
So the name of the podcast is Only in America. So the last question is, complete the sentence. Only in America, ...
Only in America can we have integrated so many immigrants over the last 50 years and over the last 200 years in such a successful and enriching way that's made our country better. We really are really good at taking in immigrants, making them feel American really quickly, and we should really build on that strength rather than weaken it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I really appreciate it.
Mary Waters is the John L. Loeb Professor of Sociology and the PVK Professor of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University. She chaired the National Academy of Sciences panel that issued the report, The Integration of Immigrants in American Society. For more about Mary, visit our website, immigrationforum.org, and while you're there, take a second to subscribe to Only in America, and take another second to tell a friend about Only in America. Thank you for listening.
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the James Irvine Foundation, expanding opportunity for the people of California, and from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, established in 1911 by Andrew Carnegie to promote the advancement and diffusion of knowledge and understanding.
Thanks for listening to Only in America this week. The show is produced by Regina Medina and Emily Chow. Our sound editor this week is Megan Wetmore. And Kathleen Farrell is the executive producer. Thanks for listening. I'm Ali Noorani.